All right, well, thank you all for coming, both in person and on Facebook. This is week 5, lecture 5 of the 7-week Tolkien lecture series. This week's presentation is called The Christian Epic of Lord of the Rings. So if you remember last week, so if you weren't here last week, basically the conclusion I came to was that The Lord of the Rings is basically, for Tolkien, a synthesis of Beowulf and Christianity. To sort of briefly go over what we talked about before, Beowulf for Tolkien is an image of a pre-Christian England. It has elements of paganism that are unshrouded by Christianity, something that Tolkien thought was very desirable in creating a mythological foundation for the English people, something that would predate the introduction of Christianity around the 7th century AD, and would be really tied to the languages and the peoples that had originally lived there. And so within the context of his sort of wider mythology, The Lord of the Rings grows out of this desire for this English mythology and becomes something that is inextricably linked to his Christianity.
Andrew?
Yes?
What is that emblem?
This is Tolkien's own monogram that he used. So in the middle is a J, and then the 2 R's are split.
Okay. Thank you.
So this has been used. It's actually somewhat not interesting at all, but a piece of trivia. This specific emblem, I don't know if it was ever actually used by Tolkien, or at least not very much. This was sort of post his success, that this was kind of drummed up by the estate and publishers.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep. So a brief history of what The Lord of the Rings actually is, because as I said, it is to me a synthesis of Beowulf and Christianity, but that's not what it was originally. Originally, it was what he called the New Hobbit. After the Hobbit became a moderate success, very early, his publisher said, "Well, look, this is getting good reviews. It's probably going to sell pretty well. Can you write a new one?" And Tolkien said that he's sort of trying to write a sequel to The Hobbit, obviously. So it's a book that is very much.
One of the school teachers is trying to say.
She's trapped.
You just go through.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
How are you?
Sorry.
Minutes from now, so I gotta put it.
I'm sorry. I hear the kids like in my ear.
Take a brief pause. All right, so if you are familiar with the text of Lord of the Rings, you're aware that it is markedly different from The Hobbit. The Hobbit is a children's story, episodic adventures about a little man who goes around and fights trolls and dragons and all these sorts of things. And so when Tolkien sat down to write the Hobbit sequel, which would become The Lord of the Rings, it was very much the same. It was simply a children's story with episodic adventures, and it didn't have any of the kind of depth or intensity that it would later grow to have. So The Lord of the Rings in its inception is not this kind of grand mythological synthesis that I think it is. And so it had to develop into that. And so Tolkien was not really enthusiastic about the sequel originally either. He sort of didn't think it was going to work. He said, "I am a little perturbed. I cannot think of anything more to say about hobbits, but I have only too much to say, and much already written about the world into which the Hobbit intruded." And he would go on to say that even Sauron, the Terrible, peeked over the edge of the Hobbit. If you remember the story, there's this kind of ethereal necromancer character that never really shows up, and he's just sort of a plot device to get Gandalf off the screen, so he's not solving all the problems for the heroes. But for Tolkien, this was sort of an image of this Sauron character that would become the big focus of The Lord of the Rings, who had already existed in his earlier mythology. But you can see here he's saying, look, I've been writing this mythology for 20 years now, and that's all I've got. I wrote this little story about hobbits. I have nothing else to really talk about, so I don't really know how it's going to work. Something else he said, December of 1937, so 3 months after the release of The Hobbit, Mr. Baggins began as a comic tale among conventional and inconsistent Grimm's fairy tale dwarves and got drawn to the edge of it. And that's what he says, so that even Sauron the Terrible peeped over the edge. And he would still say, what more can hobbits even do? The images you see here are Tolkien's illustration of Bilbo Baggins in his hobbit, and someone else's illustration of Morgoth, the sort of Luciferian god character from the mythology. And there's really nothing at all that draws these two together. They're drastically different in almost every way. And Tolkien kind of thought hobbits were a one-trick pony. He was like, this is this goofy little English countryside people that don't like adventures, and you can draw one of them into this bigger world. But he said fundamentally they can be comic, but their comedy is suburban unless it is set against things more elemental. But the real fun about orcs and dragons, to my mind, was before their time. So not only do they not line up thematically, which you could draw a contrast in, but they also, for Tolkien, the elder days of this kind of earlier mythology are way in the past, and you can't possibly have the two integrate because it wouldn't make any sense in the wider mythology. But as we obviously know, given the Lord of the Rings, he finds a way to reconcile these two, and they do come together. And so this tale grew in the telling is actually the opening of the second edition of the Lord of the Rings that came out in 1965. And so post sort of looking back upon, reflecting upon how this actually came to be, it would say this story was drawn irresistibly toward the older world and became an account, as it were, of its end and passing away. And so if you remember from last time, I sort of described how in Tolkien's mythology the mythological world is sort of in a state of decay. The elder days of this kind of grand conflict between the elves and the gods are passing away, especially with the introduction of men. And so the beginnings of the synthesis are basically found here, which is that Tolkien is starting to merge the end of the mythological age with the dawn of humankind, and therefore the dawn of hobbits as well, which is sort of a specialized subset of humankind. And so what happens is that hobbits become thrust into this world into which they really don't belong. This is not a place that makes sense for them to be. They don't have any special powers. They don't have any kind of real ability to reside in this mythological world. But so it's the fact that the world is fading that allows us to have, that as the sort of decline happens, the hobbits can jump up into the sort of last stages of the mythology and actually make some sense. So this is mechanically, basically, how it ends up working. But obviously, I promised Christianity here, I haven't really mentioned it yet. So you may ask, why on earth, even if he's able to synthesize these things, what does that have to do with Christianity? Where is that coming from? Obviously, the Silmarillion, as I've said before, very intentionally contains no Christianity. He was very emphatic about the fact that the King Arthur stories included Christianity explicitly and therefore were not acceptable as true English mythology. And so as his sort of personal new Beowulf story, he intentionally excluded Christianity from the Silmarillion. The Hobbit, of course, is not really complex enough to even have Christianity in it. It is simply a children's story. So there's nothing there. But then, of course, he famously would describe Lord of the Rings as, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. And so somehow that makes sense, that it's drawn from these different elements, and somehow, and even as he says here, as a matter of fact, I have consciously planned very little, and should chiefly be grateful for having been brought up in a faith that has nourished me and taught me all the little that I know. So he wasn't even consciously attempting to instill Christianity in the Lord of the Rings. It is somehow this strange combination of this children's story, this wider mythology, and his own personal faith that all smish together in some way that allows Christianity to take a center stage in the Lord of the Rings. And so we maybe can see a little bit of how this happens with that last sort of point about the hobbits being human beings, that the humanity is now very fully being drawn into the mythology. Because it is somehow within the context of the mythical world. I apologize that sound is coming through. That is the phone reading record ringing. But it's somehow that the introduction of humanity, of the hobbits, into the world that creates the Christianity. That is the fundamental point. Because alone they have neither, but somehow bringing this sort of low Christian epic. And it's not something that sort of is just a clumsy mistake to have him act, where he just accidentally included his own Christianity and sort of regretted it. Upon reflection, he would say, the last tale, that being The Lord of the Rings, blends the high legends and a human point of view. And so this is what he realized as he had gone back, was that somehow bringing the humans in, he grounded the Silmarillion, grounded mythology into a very accessible, on a spiritual level almost, an accessible story that would make sense for humanity. Hobbits, in this sense, are humanity. They are our introduction to the world. If you read the Silmarillion by itself, it is distant elves and gods that are operating in a plane that we do not have access to. So by putting the hobbits there, they sort of venture for us into the legendarium in a way that we would not otherwise. They're somehow interacting with these kind of grand mythological elements in a way that doesn't really make any sense. And so what's very interesting about this is, if you remember back to, I guess, the second lecture, and talking about how fairy, the land of fairy kind of operates, it's very much an externalization of internal conflicts. And so when you see the primal forces of good and evil existing in tangible reality, you have, in this case, sort of great Eye of Sauron in Mordor, the land of darkness, and you have heroes of the West, the captains of the West, and these two giant primeval forces going head to head. That's not because Tolkien didn't understand the nature of good and evil. It's because in fantasy you're giving an external reality to the internal conflicts that we experience in our day-to-day world. So the secondary world contains explicit representations in the forms of gods and monsters of what we feel within our souls. And so the hobbits, in this way, are living in this world that, as I said, they don't belong to. They're intruding upon the externalized plane. They themselves are not really fantastical creatures to a great extent. They're certainly fae, you might say. They're little small people, but fundamentally they're basically human beings. And so they're allowed access into this externalized reality where good and evil have tangible presences in a way that we, it's a place not meant to be trodden by mortal feet, you might say. And so while we can't go and experience the war in heaven and watch Michael the Archangel casting the devil from the heavens, the hobbits can. The hobbits can go there and say, look, this is Sauron duking it out with Galadriel and all the heroes of the west of Middle-earth. And so in this way, we and the hobbits are not meant to be here, but we get access to it. We're allowed in to get a personal view of the mythological world. And so as I said, this is sort of as if we were granted access into the Christian heaven as we understand it. If we could actually go there and not just tell stories about it, but interact with it and understand it. And so it's in this introduction of the sort of meek and lowly human being into the mythological world that we actually start to see the glimmers of Christianity. At the most basic level, it's the sort of just fundamental acknowledgement that humans are weak and frail in comparison to the mythological world, especially to Christ and to God, and of course the devil and his fallen angels. But this, of course, can be said for any spiritual tradition that holds that humans are lesser than the gods, which is all of them. So the more precise key point for Tolkien is that the hobbits, in their smallness and in their infinite meekness, are not an image of Christ, but represent the sort of aspects of Christianity that we valorize and that we hold dear to in our modern religion. Obviously, Christ himself, as the image, was born in a manger and is the lowly figure. His strength is not in arms, it's not in battles, it's not in this traditional mythologized external world. It is in healing and love and compassion and forgiveness. And so the hobbits, in their complete lack of physical prowess and magical acumen, are forced to follow in these footsteps. They do not have a choice. They are not able to go off and fight the armies of orcs by themselves because they simply do not have the physical ability to do so. So they are intruding upon this world in which they have no spiritual business, they have no physical business, but they have some other business that Tolkien is going to focus on. And so this is what I would consider a subversion of the heroic image. Beowulf and the Silmarillion are stories that focus on the traditional grand heroic narrative. You have your great heroes slaying dragons, fighting monsters, getting treasure hoards, fighting the primeval forces of darkness with sword and shield in hand, dying gloriously on the battlefield. Obviously, Christ is a subversion of this worldview, and this is something that Tolkien points out in his analysis of Beowulf, is that that there is no mention of Christ because Christ is in a way antithetical to the entire spirit of the sort of Beowulf tradition. He's not about warfare. He's not about fighting. And of course, as we talk about in Christianity, when Christ showed up, the Jews were not really expecting somebody who was sort of preaching against the law and talking about faith and hope and love. They were expecting someone who was going to help them beat back the Romans and reclaim the holy city. And so in this same way then, and again the hobbits are not a proxy of Christ, but they fulfill the same kind of narrative purpose, in that they are a complete subversion of the grand and mythical narrative of the Silmarillion, where you have these great heroes. You now have the smallest of all heroes that have none of the kind of powerful archetypal strength as someone like this. This is an image of Turambar, the great hero of the First Age. And so, if you remember from the Lord of the Rings, about midway through the first book, they get to the Council of Elrond, where the whole plot is kind of laid out, and Frodo takes up the quest of the ring. But there's a lot of stuff that happens that's very interesting here. Elrond, the half-elven lord of Rivendell, says, as Frodo claims this burden, he says, "Though all the mighty elf friends of old, Hador and Húrin, and Túrin and Beren himself were assembled together, your seat should be among them." Now, no one could know this at the time, but you can kind of get a vibe for how grand and lofty these names are. Húrin is a hero who single-handedly slew 70 orcs, then was taken prisoner by Lucifer himself and confronted him, and they had a dialogue back and forth. Túrin was the slayer of Glaurung, the father of dragons, and Beren is one of the greatest heroes of the First Age, who snuck into Morgoth, the Luciferian character's throne room, to steal a Silmaril, is the great jewel of the First Age, from the very crown of Lucifer's head. And so these are mythical level heroes, that just absolutely imbued with a physical and mental prowess that is completely unmatched, certainly by any hobbit, and not at all by Frodo. He's a 50-year-old, 3-foot-tall, middle-aged man, effectively, who was drawn out of his home, just like his uncle was, into this world of gods and monsters. Frodo could not be further from this kind of archetype of power. And yet Elrond says, you're right there with him. He hasn't even done anything yet. It's his act alone of taking up this task, taking up this burden, despite having no place in the story, that is worthy of recognition. And this is seen clearly in the way that Frodo takes the burden itself. The line is, "I will take the ring, though I do not know the way." The Council of Elrond is sitting around all questioning what to do, and Frodo, in a simple and load-bearing, load-up-taking way, says, "I will take the ring, though I do not know the way." It could not be more simple and more Christ-like, you might say. And then you get even more interesting things from Elrond. He says, "This is the hour of the Shire folk when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great. Who of the wise could have foreseen it? Or if they are wise, why should they expect to know it until the hour has struck?" And there, I think there's a very, to me, very clear reference, or very clear resonance of the verse in the Gospel. "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not even the angels of heaven." We have this kind of resonance of these Christ-like properties, that these are unheralded, kind of divine entrances into the world. There's nothing in the First Age of Middle-earth, just as there's nothing in the Old Testament, really, that can prepare you for what this grand subversion of the narrative, that Frodo is going to shake the Towers of the Great despite being an absolute no one who has no place in the story, just as Christ is going to overtake the world with love instead of conquest. Who of the wise could have foreseen it? And Frodo, in his role, then, takes up the kind of ultimate archetypal position as the perfect representation of us. As I've said earlier, Frodo's not going to be leading a military charge. He's not going to be confronting the devils on the field of battle. He can't go and look at the external evil in person and expect to come out on top at all. The arrival of the meek and lowly into the center stage is the natural byproduct of introducing humans at all into the mythological world. If we're going to tell a story about ourselves and we are up against these grand destructive forces, there's no possible way we're going to meet them in battle. We're not going to meet the devil hand to hand and come out on top. But Tolkien's sort of perspective on this that he brought up in an interview in 1965 was that he said, reflecting upon this very moment when Frodo claims the ring, he said, "I've always been impressed that we're here surviving because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds. Jungles, volcanoes, wild beasts. They struggle on, almost blindly in a way. Frodo had very little idea, really." And so it's not even the case that Frodo is saying, I understand exactly what's going on, and I understand my place here, that I don't really belong here, but I'm going to take up the burden anyway. It's that even then there's this great unknown. There's nothing for him to draw upon experience-wise beyond a simple Christian ethic, a simple taking up of a burden in order that the world might be saved. And in this same interview, right after this, he says, "I thought the wisest remark in the whole book was that where Elrond says that the wheels of the world are turned by the small hands, while the great are looking elsewhere, and they turn because they have to, because it's their daily job." And this is in reference to what Elrond says, which is basically, Tolkien basically paraphrases it, but that in this new world, in this sort of more fully realized and grounded world, it is not going to be the hands of the great that are going to be changing what's going on. Tolkien thinks that, by and large, it is the small people of the world whose actions are responsible for making things happen. That the eyes of the great are focused on these grand things, but on the ground level, it is the people like Frodo and the people like Sam who goes with him that are going to be responsible for, basically making everything happen. And so that is at the core of the Christian ethic for Tolkien. I'll elaborate on that a little bit later. And again, this is the might of the meek arising, and I'll quote again, "This is the hour of the Shire folk when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great." And so it's this interesting contrast where it's not just that Elrond is saying, look, the little guy is the one who turns the wheels of the world, but it's also that little guy has the capacity to have influence upon the great. They're looking elsewhere, but there is a tangible, real-world effect of the people like the hobbits upon the world. And then, so obviously, it is not raw power that is doing this. It is not simply the great are the ones with the raw power. So the little guys, the small hands of the world that are moving the wheels, have a Christianized strength. They have a strength of spirit. And Elrond kind of hints at what this might be when he says, "The road must be trod, but it will be very hard, and neither strength nor wisdom will carry us far upon it." And so these kind of virtues of the great that you might think of, strength and wisdom, that these are kind of the principles of the first age, of the elder days. These are these great heroes, have these capacities that allow them to tread the road. But this road is not going to be trodden that way. And so what is it? What is this virtue that the small have that the great maybe don't lack, but that they are not traditionally focused upon? And this, you may groan to hear, is love. And before you do groan, obviously the quote here is from 1 Corinthians, "And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love." So Tolkien's message is no cornier than the message of the Bible, if you're worried. But really, this is the case. It is love that is at the heart of the Lord of the Rings. And this is probably surprising for some people to hear, because it's certainly not the impression you would likely get from the films that have come out. But lying very much at the heart of the story is love. And so when I would refer to this as agape, which is the Greek, one of the 5 main Greek words for love, which is a general unconditional love. In the Bible, it is used to refer to the love that God has for his people, an unconditional love. But it is also then used in a reflective kind of way to illustrate when humans imitate the love that God has for them when they share it with each other. It is a loving, back and forth relationship of total giving, you might say. And so this type of love is seen throughout the Lord of the Rings. It's right at the beginning, in chapter 2 of the first book, that Frodo says, "I must keep the ring and guard it, at least for the present, whatever it may do to me, because I should like to save the Shire if I could." And this is something that comes back again at the Council of Elrond, when he says, "I will take the ring, though I do not know the way." It is a complete openness and loving spirit to save the Shire, to save Middle-earth, to save his friends. And it is with this love for his home and for his hearth that he sets out to persevere on the quest. And then this last line is from Samwise Gamgee, another line you certainly are not going to hear in the films. This is a moment where Frodo is sleeping and Sam is cradling his head, and Frodo, he sees the kind of scars and wrinkles of age and stress upon Frodo's face, and he says, "I love him. He's like that, and sometimes it shines through somehow, but I love him whether or no." I love him whether or no. That is the heart of the story, is this love, this unconditional agape for the fellow Hobbit and for Middle-earth. But it's not the only kind of love that's important in the story. Something that becomes exceedingly important is love your enemies. This is, for me, what has always been the most difficult call of the Christian faith, but certainly one of the most important, if not the most important. And of course, here is the line from Matthew, "I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous." And this is a fundamental aspect of Tolkien's Christian faith, and what he necessarily then pours into the story, which is that, we're all united under God's banner. God, no matter who you are and what you do, you're not going to escape from the love of God. You're not going to escape from the sun rising and setting on the good and evil. And so the way that this comes into the story is in the character of Gollum, who, the way that the Lord of the Rings is structured, actually the book, is something that was basically unreplicable in the films, which is that you have the first book of the Lord of the Rings, which is called The Fellowship of the Ring, is divided into 2 parts, and the end of the second part is the breaking of the Fellowship, in which everyone splits up. And then from there on, the last 4 books, there are 6 ultimate books of the Lord of the Rings. So the Two Towers is divided into 2 books, and the Return of the King is divided into 2 as well. And the second of each of those 2 books, or the second book of each of those 2 volumes, is centered exclusively on Frodo and Sam and Gollum. So you have the first half, which follows Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli on their quest across Middle-earth, and then you have entire sections of chapters dedicated just to this story. It is not intercutting, because there needs to be a strong focus on the ring-bearer and his journey to Mount Doom, which is the ultimate point of the story. And so Gollum's appearance on the scene marks the entrance of the Love Your Enemies theme, which is incredibly important to the overall plot. And so this begins back in The Hobbit. Ultimately, the backstory for Gollum is that he's a corrupted hobbit. He murdered his friend Deagle in order to get the One Ring. And so the One Ring has its entrance into the modern age in a murder of a hobbit by another hobbit. He was thrown out of his community and hid under the mountains for 500 years until Bilbo comes along in the events of The Hobbit and confronts him and gets the ring from him. But the important part of The Hobbit, which Tolkien actually had to go back and kind of revise to make it fit in with this grander theme, is this moment here, as seen in a somewhat lackluster film, but is a moment where Bilbo has taken the ring, has put it on, realized it makes him invisible, and is about to just kill Gollum. He has the opportunity to kill him. He knows that Gollum would have killed him, given the opportunity to eat him. And to his thought process is, he was desperate. He must get away out of this terrible darkness while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing, put its eyes out, kill it. It meant to kill him. And then his moment of realization, of pity, of this love for enemy, is, no, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. And he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden understanding and a pity mixed with horror welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless, unmarked days without light or hope of betterment, hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. And so this is this really empathetic view of evil, the pathetic kind of aspect of someone who has fallen into a state so low that it is very easy to sort of desire its death, but this kind of shining through moment in Bilbo's head allows him to glimpse the necessity of pity. And this, I think, is an important point as well, because the word pity in modern context has taken on a largely negative attitude. Pity is seen as very kind of arrogant, and you're looking down on someone and saying, I'm better than you, and I feel bad for how much better I am than you, effectively. But this is not the way Tolkien's using it. It's not the way it's supposed to be meant. A word that actually works very well with it is condescension, another word that has been ruined by modern usage. Condescension in its original intent means a lowering of stature down to someone's level who is someone lower than you, maybe in some kind of grander hierarchical sense. But for the purposes of this, it just means to me, Gollum is in this pathetic, lowly state, and Bilbo lowers himself down to his level and empathizes with him. And so pity and condescension as positives are good things here. Tolkien would write in a letter that really a fundamental aspect of pity is that it can't be in any way self-serving. Pity must restrain one from doing something immediately desirable and seemingly advantageous. And so this is Bilbo's, lack of killing of Gollum is rejecting his pragmatic necessity, I guess you might say. But even here, there's no theology that is baked in here, really. In the story of The Hobbit, it's just Bilbo has a moment of kind of general goodness that you might say is Christian, but you might just say is a kind of general respect for ethic. But this here again is this remarkable thing where if you take this moment and you bring it into this grander mythology, it then takes on this gigantic importance and significance that would never have had otherwise. And so this takes the place of Gollum's appearance in The Lord of the Rings. Gollum takes up an immensely important role in The Lord of the Rings. And so Frodo, reflecting upon Gollum, who he knows now is following him and trying to get the ring back, Frodo says to Gandalf, what a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had a chance. And Gandalf's response is pity. It was pity that stayed his hand, pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. And Frodo replies, I am sorry, but I am frightened that I don't feel any pity for Gollum. He is as bad as an orc and just an enemy. He deserves death. And Gandalf replies, deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment. For even the wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill before the end. And when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not the least. And so this goes back into the kind of principle that humans have certain things that they are not meant to have access to. And so, for what Gandalf is saying here is that Frodo, you want to be, accusatory and to deal out death, but if there are people that die that deserve life, and there are people that live that deserve death, you certainly don't have access to the ability to save those people that die that deserve to live, which is an indication of the fact that you're playing in a realm that is beyond you. It is not your place to decide who lives and who dies, and who's worthy of judgment and who's worthy of redemption. That is not the lot of the human being. The mythological world that this resides in is beyond our province as human beings. And so this then ties right back into the Christian message, which is that all we can do as people is to live in this love of enemy and love of everything. It is love that is the core that grounds the existence of people in Middle-earth and in our Earth. I'm going to skip past this next slide. All right. And lest you be concerned that I'm sort of overinflating the importance of pity here, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many is written verbatim in each of the 3 volumes of The Lord of the Rings. It is something that's the only such statement that I'm aware of that is emphatically stated, and it will be, I hope, clear later why that is. A Tolkien critic named Ralph Wood said that this sentence is indeed the leitmotif of Tolkien's epic, its animating theme, its Christian epicenter, as well as its circumference. And so certainly there are many who believe that this really is the heart of the story, is this love of the enemy and this real emboldening of the Christian ethic seen in pity for the enemy. And so, whereas Frodo before had this negative view of Gollum and Tolkien up until he wanted him to die, this sentence first comes back in the beginning of the Two Towers, or the beginning of the part of the Two Towers that focuses on Tolkien or on Frodo, and he says, "Oh, this is a poor wretch, and now that I see him, I do pity him." And so Frodo ends up taking Gollum along on this journey, against all reasonable suggestion or against all pragmatic thought. He takes along this creature that he knows desires the ring above all other things and would happily kill him for it if he had the opportunity. But Frodo takes him along as another burden. He has the ring already, and he takes along another piece of baggage for the ride. And it is this that is the fundamentally Christian thing to do, is to take a situation in which you have nothing to gain by showing pity, and really everything to lose by doing so. And instead of making the pragmatic choice, it is making the right choice, which for Tolkien is a very important distinction. And so when Frodo spares Gollum, that is the second time that he's been spared. He's been first spared by Bilbo, and second by Frodo. And Sam initially is not a fan of this. Sam is sort of the lower level character who's less intelligent and sort of less high-minded, I guess, than Frodo is. But he develops over the course of the story as well, and he has his own moment of this Christian pity, and in the heart of this story. And Sam's actually comes at the moment of greatest peril. It is as they have reached Mordor, they're journeying toward Mount Doom to destroy the One Ring, to destroy Sauron from the face of the world. And Gollum has reappeared, and he's sort of been lost, and they thought he was gone, but he's reappeared, and he's raring to go to take the ring back. And Sam, in full capacity of killing Gollum, looks at him, and deep in his heart, there was something that restrained him from killing Gollum. He could not strike this thing lying in the dust, forlorn, ruinous, utterly wretched. He guessed the agony of Gollum's shriveled mind and body, enslaved to that ring, unable to find peace or relief ever in life again. And so that sounds actually very much like what Bilbo felt when he looked at Gollum as well, is this real deep empathy for the state of this evil creature, who certainly has done evil and reprehensible things that are maybe worthy of death, and yet the Christian act is love and compassion and empathy and pity. So that is sort of the big theme. But all of this comes to a head. All of the sort of Christian ideas that Tolkien has been establishing throughout the book come to a head at the most important moment of the entire book, which is at the very moment within Mount Doom, at the Samath Naur, the forge that Sauron used to cast the One Ring, that Frodo reaches this place, the quest apparently achieved, holds the ring over the fiery depths that will destroy him forever. But Tolkien's final, what I would call was a masterstroke of subversion, is that Frodo fails the quest at the end. He does not succeed. Frodo takes the ring from off the chain, gives a grand pronouncement that he is now taking the ring as his lord and master, puts it on his finger, and all is lost. It's all over. Frodo has made it to the very, very brink of the destruction of the ring, and the very brink of success of the quest, and he fails. This, of course, is, as I said, the ultimate subversion. So we've already, of course, had that he has no traits of a traditional hero. He has no strength, no magical powers, none of these things. But not only does he lack those things, he also fails. He can't even complete the quest with these virtues that seem to have been so worthy in him. But if you remember back to the earlier talk of Eucatastrophe in the second lecture, you know that this can't be the end of the story. This maybe in Beowulf, maybe in the Silmarillion, maybe in these pre-Christian worlds of doom and gloom and a lack of hope, this would be the end of the story. A realistic and sad and somber and unhopeful ending. But what we see fully realized in this moment is how this Christian message of pity and love is brought to bear at the moment of greatest doom. That it's not strength that brings about the quest fulfillment, nor is it strength that brings about its failure, really. It's simply a lack of human ability, you might say. Tolkien says that what brings about the final victory that must come in a great fairy story is pity, which he says is a word to me of moral and imaginative worth. It is the pity of Bilbo and later Frodo that ultimately allows the quest to be achieved. And so somehow, even with the failure, Gollum bites off Frodo's finger. Really, everything is horrible. There's no end in sight here that is positive for the heroes, because Gollum has the ring. Frodo first claimed it. Gollum now has it. And so, what could possibly tie all this together? How could the pity and the love reconcile? Those already happened in the past. How can that possibly bring about change at this moment of greatest despair? And so, this is where God comes in. God, of course, cannot explicitly come in, because Tolkien was adamantly against that. He doesn't betray his own rule here and have God come step in and talk to somebody. But this is the moment that the true merging of the heroic and the Christian comes in. That the ultimate conclusion of these things all come to a head. The moment that actually occurs in the book, Gollum bites off Frodo's finger, claims the ring for his own, takes it in his hand, starts leaping for joy, and falls. He just falls into the cracks of doom, destroying himself and the One Ring in the process. Another subversion. There is no grand death. Frodo doesn't cut off Gollum's head. He doesn't push him into the fire, despite what you see again in the films, which completely botch this moment. It is a moment of simple chance. That's all that happens. Gollum falls in. But to this there is more than meets the eye. At this moment of great failure, it is only through God's grace that the ending can be achieved. Because of course, the entire story is in God's hands. God, Eru Ilúvatar, in the context of Tolkien's mythology, is God. It is a God who has the plan for the world and who knows what's going on and knows every aspect of everything, just as our God does. But it's not freely given. It's not something that you can just walk in and expect is going to happen. Frodo can't just go there and say, well, it doesn't matter what I do now, because God can just fix everything. God intervenes with grace in acknowledgement, you might say, of the sacrifice that Frodo has been making. Tolkien writes that the salvation of the world and Frodo's own salvation is achieved by his previous pity and forgiveness of injury. And so it is God doing these things, but it is also a simple outcome of what's happening. So Frodo lets Gollum live, lets him come along for the ride, allows him a place of honor, you might say, a place of pity within this trio of hobbits. And it is Gollum's own actions that lead to the destruction of the ring. But he's only able to make these actions because Frodo spared his life, because Bilbo spared his life, and because Sam spared his life. It is in sparing Gollum's life that Gollum is put in the position that he's able to bite off Frodo's finger and fall into the cracks of doom. And so this is the interplay between free will and God's grace. And in a sort of little-known essay that Tolkien wrote, sort of philosophizing about his own world, called Fate and Free Will, Tolkien writes, when Frodo's will proved in the end inadequate, a means for the ring's destruction immediately appeared, being kept in reserve by God, as it were. And so it is God's providence that allows for these events to occur, and yet they are also channeled through the actions of the heroes, of Frodo and Sam. And there's this beautiful interplay between those two things. There's that God is in the details. It is in the love, in the lack of pragmatism in the actions of Frodo and Sam and Bilbo that allow any of this to happen in the first place. And so, of course, it is then only in acting like Christ that Frodo succeeds. And of course, Frodo is not Christ in any kind of literal or allegorical sense. But the values that are instilled here are the same. Tolkien writes, to pity Gollum, to forbear to kill him, was a piece of folly, or a mystical belief in the ultimate value in itself of pity and generosity, even if disastrous in the world of time. And I really like this, because he's saying this immense folly is one and the same, indistinguishable from the mystical belief in the ultimate value in itself of pity and generosity. So it is foolish. It makes no sense. It is not something that makes any logical sense in the world of time, as he says. To make the right action would be to stop Gollum and make sure he doesn't prevent the quest, because the quest is about the fate of the world. If the quest fails, the world is destroyed by Sauron, and everything goes to hell. Literally. But the good in itself, the value in itself of pity and mercy and generosity are still the right choice, even in the face of the end of the world, quite literally. And Frodo says after the deed is done, after Gollum is dead, he says, "But for him, Sam, I could not have destroyed the ring. The quest would have been in vain, even at the bitter end. So let us forgive him, for the quest is achieved." And this, you might see echoes of maybe Judas Iscariot. You know, this is, of course, a classic problem, or perceived problem for Christianity, is Christ must die, Christ must be crucified in order for the world to be redeemed. But that means that somebody has to betray him. And if someone has to betray him, then it's going to be one of his friends. And if it's one of his friends, does that friend really have any choice? Did Judas have any choice? And is Judas not really a hero for stepping in for us and betraying Christ to the authorities? And I don't think that is what we should take away. It is almost paradoxical. It's a paradoxical interplay between fate and free will and the love of God. And I think summed up very well in the prayer of St. Francis, that it is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And in this case, it takes up a literal meaning. It is in pardoning Gollum that the world is pardoned, that Frodo and Sam are saved. All of these things come together through a paradoxical action. Just as it's a paradox that Gollum should be forgiven because it is his action that destroyed the ring, and yet he was clearly bad and did evil things. All of these things are almost beyond human comprehension, you might say. And so then, to sum it up, really the point, or one of the many points that I will be discussing, I guess, later, is that the call of Christ for Tolkien is what is displayed in these hobbits. that when you bring humans into contact with these forces beyond human comprehension or control, and the fate of the world is literally at stake, it is still proper and right to meet evil with charity and forgiveness and generosity and love. And not expecting grace from these things. Not saying, well, if I do this, then God will fix everything at the end. That is not to be expected. It is simply to do it for its own good, because the world beyond is the world of virtue and the world that judges all human beings. We surrender to our need for grace. We acknowledge that there is a power beyond ourselves over which we have no control, but over which God does have control. And so, the way this is made manifest in Lord of the Rings is obviously in this externalized evil world. We have the great eye of Sauron in the east and the One Ring as these physically imposing and corrupting influences. And we see Frodo withering away and wasting away as he journeys farther and farther into Mordor with the One Ring. And so, again, this is an externalization. This is not something that we're going to face every day. We are not going to have to decide whether or not to kill Gollum on the street, in any kind of literal sense. But we see in Frodo's labored journey to Mount Doom, faced almost always with what would be the benefit of pragmatism, of making the choice that rewards us in the material world for doing something that we know to be morally wrong. And so it is our choice in the primary world that is the same as the choice in the secondary world. What we see reflected in The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbits is to meet the corrupting influences of evil that are not so obvious as they are in the marches of Mordor, but we meet them with the same grace and the same love that Christ calls for all of us. And that is it. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to field them, and if not, that's totally fine.
That blew my mind.
What's that?
That blew my mind.
It blew my mind when I first got figured it out, too. So I'll make sure there's nothing on Facebook. I guess there's not, but no. All right. Well, thank you for joining us on Facebook as well.